Hello everyone, and I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore an emotional story about an unfinished house, a struggling young family, and the surprising moment when Kiet's mother finally visits the woman his father once strongly opposed. Will she truly accept Tu Nha and Little Pineapple as part of the family, or will old conflicts return once again? Stay with us until the end to discover how love, sacrifice, and family slowly changed everything inside this small, unfinished home. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Kiet's unfinished house stood quietly at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by piles of broken bricks, torn cement bags, and rough patches of sand that had been left untouched for days. Parts of the walls still exposed raw red bricks because there wasn't enough money to finish the plastering. And even the front porch looked incomplete, with only half the floor tiled, while the remaining ground stayed uneven and dusty. But despite everything still looking unfinished, the small house somehow never felt empty. Most of that warmth came from Little Pineapple. Her tiny footsteps echoed across the floor as she ran from one corner of the house to another, laughing at small things only children could understand. While she played nearby, Kiet spent the day crouching beside the porch, carefully laying bricks one by one, trying to make the house feel a little more stable than it had the day before. Every few minutes, Pineapple would suddenly stretch her arms toward him with impatient little cries, demanding attention again. And no matter how exhausted he looked, Kiet always stopped immediately to pick her up. Sometimes he carried her with one arm while continuing to move bricks with the other. Sometimes he sat beside her on the unfinished floor, whispering awkward little jokes that made her laugh so hard she nearly lost balance. His shirt was covered in dust and dried cement. Sweat constantly rolled down the side of his face, yet he still carefully adjusted Pineapple's tiny clothes whenever they slipped from her shoulders and gently wiped dirt away from her cheeks with rough hands hardened by labor. Behind them, the tiny kitchen looked just as unfinished as the rest of the house. An old aluminum pot sat beside a few vegetables and freshly picked chili peppers laid out carefully to dry because the family still could not afford a refrigerator. There was almost nothing valuable inside the home. No expensive furniture, no decorations, no comfort, and yet every corner carried traces of effort and sacrifice, proof that two exhausted people were trying desperately not to give up on life. Kiet rarely spoke about the pressure weighing on him every day, but it showed in the way his eyes constantly drifted toward the unfinished walls around him, as though completing the house meant protecting the fragile family he had fought so hard to keep together. Outside, a loose tarp covering part of the roof trembled softly in the wind, while Pineapple pointed toward it and burst into laughter. Kiet looked at her quietly for a moment before suddenly lifting her high into the air, smiling softly as her laughter filled the unfinished house. In that moment, it became painfully obvious that her laughter was the only thing still giving him enough strength to keep moving forward. Not long afterward, the sound of footsteps slowly approached from the dirt road outside. Tu Nha finally returned home, carrying a heavy basket filled with freshly picked chili peppers from the nearby fields. Dust clung to the edges of her clothes, and loose strands of hair stuck against her face after spending hours working outside under the heat. She looked exhausted before even stepping fully into the yard. But the moment Pineapple saw her mother, the little girl immediately ran across the unfinished floor and wrapped both arms tightly around Tu Nha's legs while laughing so hard she could barely speak. Tu Nha almost lost balance from the sudden impact before lowering herself to hug her daughter tightly against her chest. Kiet stood quietly beneath the porch, watching them for a moment before walking forward to take the heavy basket from Tu Nha's hands without saying much. Their conversations were never dramatic or emotional. Instead, they spoke about ordinary things: how many peppers she managed to harvest that day, whether the vegetables would last until the next market trip, and how they needed to dry the chili peppers because they still couldn't afford a refrigerator. But somehow, those tiny conversations carried the warmth of a real family. Inside the narrow kitchen, Tu Nha crouched beside the stove preparing dinner, while Kiet sat nearby on the unfinished floor, playing with Pineapple. Steam slowly rose from the rice pot, filling the cramped space with the smell of boiled vegetables and fresh chili peppers. Every now and then, Tu Nha turned around to remind Kiet to eat more after working all day, and every time he quietly placed more food into her bowl instead. Dinner that night was painfully simple: a few vegetables, eggs, soup, and rice. But inside the unfinished house, the sound of spoons touching bowls somehow felt heavier than luxury. It sounded like two exhausted people trying to protect the fragile peace they had built together through sacrifice, patience, and silent endurance. Kiet's mother arrived later that afternoon, while Tu Nha sat near the porch, sorting freshly picked chili peppers for drying. The yard in front of the house was still crowded with unused bricks, long wooden boards, and patches of unfinished cement scattered across the ground. The moment Tu Nha heard someone calling from outside the bamboo gate, her hands froze instantly. For a brief second, she simply stared toward the entrance without moving, almost afraid of who might be standing there. Then slowly, she stood up and brushed dust from her clothes before walking toward the gate. The moment she saw Kiet's mother standing quietly beyond the fence, holding an old fabric bag in her hands, the entire atmosphere inside the yard changed. Tu Nha lowered her head politely, but her fingers unconsciously tightened around the edge of her shirt, as though she were trying to hide how nervous she suddenly felt. Kiet's mother said nothing at first. Instead, she slowly looked around the unfinished house, carefully observing the exposed brick walls, the uneven yard, and the small kitchen hidden behind the house. When Kiet heard his mother's voice, he immediately walked out from inside and quietly pulled a bamboo chair into the middle of the yard for her to sit on. Nearby, Pineapple stared curiously at the unfamiliar woman for several seconds before slowly walking closer. Kiet's mother bent down and gently lifted the little girl into her arms, brushing Pineapple's messy hair away from her face, while continuing to glance around the unfinished home in silence. Then she started asking simple questions about work. about the house renovation, and about whether Tu Nha still harvested chili peppers every day. There were no harsh words, no cold expressions, and no rejection like the kind Tu Nha had feared in silence for so long. Then Kiet's mother noticed the dried cement still covering her son's hands. She looked at him quietly before letting out a slow breath and softly asking whether he had been struggling a lot lately. Kiet lowered his eyes with a faint smile, while nearby Tu Nha quietly turned away, hiding the tears slowly gathering at the corners of her eyes. Inside the unfinished living room, an old electric fan, hanging on the wooden wall, rotated slowly above them, pushing weak waves of air through the empty space. The bamboo furniture near the wall still carried the scent of fresh wood, while unopened cement bags remained stacked beside the corner of the room. Kiet sat across from his mother, with both hands tightly locked together, as though he were trying to hold himself steady during a conversation he had avoided for a very long time. Near the kitchen entrance, Tu Nha quietly prepared vegetables while listening carefully to every word drifting from the living room. Pineapple crawled across the unfinished floor before resting her head against Tu Nha's leg, completely unaware of the tension slowly filling the house. Kiet's mother asked about his work and about how he had been taking multiple jobs at the same time just to continue repairing the house. Kiet answered slowly, pausing often as though carefully choosing each sentence before speaking. Then unexpectedly, he mentioned his father. He admitted there had once been a period when his father fiercely opposed his relationship with Tu Nha because he believed the two of them came from completely different circumstances. His father thought Kiet was willingly dragging his own future into hardship, and the arguments inside the family had lasted for months. At one point, his father had even demanded that he completely cut off contact with Tu Nha. The room became painfully silent afterward. Tu Nha lowered her head further, her hands frozen halfway through cutting vegetables. Yet what shocked her most was not the painful memory itself, but the fact that Kiet's mother did not criticize her at all. Instead, she sat quietly for a long time while watching Pineapple playing across the floor. Then she finally spoke in a voice so soft it nearly disappeared into the silence around them, quietly saying that despite everything, Kiet had still chosen to come back to Tu Nha and Pineapple in the end. A little while later, Kiet slowly pushed open the unfinished wooden door and guided his mother through the new house he had been building piece by piece with his own hands. The floor was still covered with traces of cement dust, and several walls remained unpainted, exposing rough layers of red brick beneath the surface. Even though the house was incomplete, Kiet explained every small detail with surprising patience, almost as though he was not simply showing rooms, but introducing the fragile future he hoped to build for his family. He led his mother toward the newly tiled porch and immediately crouched down to adjust one slightly uneven brick near the entrance. Kiet admitted that he had taught himself how to lay tiles because hiring workers cost more money than he could afford. Every day, after finishing work outside, he returned home and continued repairing the house until exhaustion forced him to stop. Inside the small bedroom, a simple wooden bed stood against the wall, beneath an old but carefully folded blanket. Pineapple crawled along the edge of the bed, while Kiet watched her quietly with a faint smile before explaining that he intentionally made the room larger so his daughter would have enough space to run around as she grew older. His voice sounded calm, yet his eyes carried the quiet desperation of a man trying to protect his family with everything he had left. Kiet's mother slowly walked through each room, gently touching the unfinished walls, before stopping in front of the small indoor bathroom Kiet had recently built. He explained how they would no longer need to run outside during storms like before, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all. Then finally, she turned toward her son and admitted, Kiet and Tu Nha struggled to build a peaceful life inside their unfinished house while raising little Pineapple together. Every day, Kiet works tirelessly repairing the house by hand, while Tu Nha harvests chili peppers to support the family. Despite their poverty, the small home is filled with warmth, sacrifice, and quiet love. Tension rises when Kiet's mother unexpectedly visits the unfinished house for the first time. Tu Nha fears rejection because Kiet's father once strongly opposed their relationship due to their different circumstances. However, instead of criticizing them, Kiet's mother slowly begins to understand how hard the couple has fought to protect their family. As Kiet shows her every unfinished corner of the house, she realizes how much her son has changed. By the end of the visit, the unfinished home no longer feels temporary, but finally begins to feel like a real family.